and he couldn't even get into the arch this morning. It's all closed out for the entire day. We're super glad to have him here. He works for National Geographic and also does the YouTube station Tank Tested. I got to see a talk of his on Zoom or some online virtual platform during the pandemic, and I thought it was among the very best recording talks that I've seen. So I worked to get in touch with him, and then I really twisted his arm when I found him at AGA. And I pretend I made him an offer he couldn't refuse, but no, I just begged, and here he is. We're really glad to have you here, Alex.
Yeah.
Come on.
You can take credit cards now, so if they want to pay for the swap now, they get the.
Okay, if you want to pay for the swap or just bid really high this evening on our auction items, we take credit cards.
Yes.
Or raffle tickets?
Or
Raffle
raffle
tickets.
tickets,
You
yeah.
take credit cards for raffle tickets?
Yes.
That seems dangerous. All right, without further ado, with those announcements, right? Mr. Alex Wenchel.
Hello, everyone. So, first question, is it possible to lower the lights, or am I, it is, perfect. Excellent. So, hello, everyone. As mentioned, I was very hard to get in contact with. That is not because I did not want to be here, it is because I am terrible at email and text and really every way of communicating.
Great at communicating.
My name is Alex Wenchel. I am an aquarist, and I'm also a documentary filmmaker. So I've been an aquarist for more than 25 years and a filmmaker for around 15. For my day job, I work for National Geographic, which is amazing. It also gives me the opportunity to work closely with photographers that are insanely talented, and I've got to learn a lot from them. And while learning from them, I have, that is playing, good. While learning from them, I've tried to apply some of those techniques to the home aquarium and photographing aquariums in people's living rooms. Now, today I'm going to talk through the thought process I go through in photographing aquariums rather than the specific technical specifications of anything. I don't find that being prescriptive is terribly helpful. That will teach you how to do one thing, but not teach you how to think about doing things. That said, if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them during Q&A. So, I want to begin by, first showing off this aquarium. This is an aquarium that was in my living room for about 2 years. It's a 150-gallon aquarium. It no longer exists, so pretty strong case for documenting, because I'm really happy that I still get to see it sometimes. Today, I want to approach this talk with this phrase in mind: see with new eyes. So my goal today should be to introduce things that are already quite familiar to all of you, but will change how you think about things like lighting. Now, this is something that you can use both in photographing and documenting your fish and your aquariums and your plants, but also in how you light your aquariums at home so that you can enjoy them more on a daily basis. So, a little bit of background for me. I've been keeping aquariums for 25 years, but I've been keeping planted aquariums for about 10. And about 5 years ago, I started taking photos of my planted aquariums and playing with both entering them into competitions, and also started a YouTube channel about planted aquariums called Tank Tested. So this is one of the first aquariums that I posted to my YouTube channel. It's a 10-gallon dinner lay tank. It also no longer exists, but the tank itself does. It's in my partner's office, so she has her own tank that she's very excited about, which is dangerous because now there are two of us that like aquariums in the same house, which is bad because there's no control on that. I've also taken small nano tanks that I've entered into competitions. This is a planted tank that I entered a couple of years ago that didn't do great in the Aquatic Gardeners Association contest, but I've also entered biotope aquariums like this one. And this is a biotope of the Rio Negro region in Brazil. This won first place at the AGA biotope contest 2 years ago. So yeah, I'm very proud of this tank. And I set this up because I wanted to film close-up photography of the fish that I saw when I visited the Rio Negro. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the talk. So one of the central tenets of when I think about aquariums is I think of aquariums as art. Now, I know a lot of you breed fish and propagate plants, and your relationship with aquariums may be different. But for me, aquariums are an art form. They are an opportunity to express our creativity with a living medium. So whenever I travel, I like taking photos of people's art. Because if we start thinking of aquariums as art, they stop being that ugly eyesore in someone's living room that has just been there and has not been taken care of. They suddenly become a beautiful piece of art. So this is an aquarium at the Shed Aquarium. I think it's a really beautiful example of what a really overgrown and lush planted aquarium can be. But this orb is an orb. It's a 10-gallon sphere that my friend Ricky has up in New York City. And is a wonderful, wonderful way of displaying really, really beautiful small plants or detailed plants like this Madagascar lace that because of the magnification of the orb, you can see that lace really, really clearly. So also traveled around to the past Aquatic Gardeners Association meetings, which were in Seattle, got to photograph the biospheres up in Seattle. But the main thing I do is go to people's homes and document their home aquariums. So this tank is in a friend of mine's house. His name is Justin. He actually has an Instagram handle called AquaWorks, spelled with an E, works. He does really, really beautiful planted tanks down in Richmond, Virginia. And whenever I go to someone's home, I try to document the aquarium in a couple of ways. First, I document, the full space. Because in an instance like this, these two tanks have the same plants in them. Because I think of aquariums as art, they are having a conversation with each other. So documenting not just an aquarium, but a space is really important. But then, I get a medium shot, a shot of the entire aquarium. And I'll also get a close-up shot of things that I find interesting. And I really encourage all of you to do the same, and we'll talk about how we do that in a little bit. But it's important because, as you all know, a tank looks really beautiful 1 week, and then 3 weeks later, it's not a tank that you want to show off. So if you have the opportunity to document the tank when you're really proud of it, it's something that you can look back on years later. This tank right next to the green tank has pretty much the same plants, but I was really captivated by the tank itself because when I looked at that wall of plants in the background, that mottled texture really spoke to me, and when I looked out the window, I saw that same texture on the bricks outside. And that's what I talk about when I'm talking about documenting an aquarium where it is, because it provides new context. And while Justin maintains that he did not get inspired by the brick wall, I still think that subconsciously he did. I also document the aquariums in video, and if you can do that, I would recommend it. And you all can because you all have cell phones that shoot video. Shooting in video means that you get a sense of the movement of the aquarium because aquariums don't just have fish and shrimp, they also have current, and the movement of your plants or your biological material makes a big difference in your experience. For instance, this aquarium is my favorite aquarium that I've ever gotten to film, personally. Your results may vary, but this is my favorite aquarium. It was set up by a friend of mine named Gazenfar. He set this tank up using what we in our club called guapa grass. It's a type of hair grass that was found locally in the DC area. And what makes it special is that it doesn't put out seeds. So it doesn't reproduce through anything but runners. As a result, it's a really beautiful long hair grass. But this tank was getting broken down. Gazanfar called me and he was like, I'm thinking of breaking this tank down, and I immediately said I need to go out and film it because this is my favorite aquarium. And I'm glad I did, because the process of documenting is a conversation about the growth of your work. So this was the first planted aquarium that I ever created. It's not great, but it's something. There are issues. This was really early in me understanding how plants work, and things like the Java fern are jammed in gravel, which, as I'm sure you know, will kill Java fern eventually. But I didn't know that. But this is the only photo that I have of this tank. And shortly thereafter, I started playing with, small plants. This is dwarf baby tears in a nano 1-gallon aquarium. Started growing that out, experimenting with that. And then I moved into bringing my aquariums into my home, into my office. So we're not allowed to have aquariums at Nat Geo, which makes sense. There's lots of camera gear that's very expensive and doesn't respond well to water. But I brought this tank in over the weekend, set it up. I actually had it set up at home and just kind of brought it in. And then I added 50 cherry shrimp into this tank. And then I had all of my coworkers name a cherry shrimp, and I put a little name list on the side. And when our boss came through, they saw this list, and I was like, look, everyone got to name a shrimp. And because of morale, I got to keep the aquarium because they felt that it would be inappropriate to kick everyone's shrimp out of the building. So, that's a hot tip. It's not a photography tip of if you want an aquarium in your office, have everyone name something in it. But the reason why I bring this up is this is the only photo I have of this tank. This was a kind of a turning point for me in the aquarium hobby, because this was the first tank that I really used CO2 in. And it's the only photo that I have of it. I wish I had taken more. So now I really do go through the process of documenting my aquariums. This is another tank that I set up 4 or 5 years ago. It uses Gazanfar's grass, so I actually took the grass from his tank, planted it in my own, and created a new aquascape. And then this tank, which I love. It has won no awards, but I'm really, really proud of the work that I put into making this aquarium. And I broke it down about 18 months ago, and I'm so glad that I have this print that I can actually hang on my wall and document the work that I did. Because, aquariums are constantly changing. So the other reason why you might want to document aquariums is to actually document change. So I now take photos, even if it's not a professional photo, I take a photo of the aquarium when I first plant it, then as it starts to grow in, and then finally as it matures. Because aquariums, they change. And getting to document that process not only teaches you about how the aquarium is evolving, but also informs you for the next time so that you know about how long things take and what's working and what's not. So if you were successful in breeding fish in an aquarium, and then the next time you set that aquarium up, it's not working, if you have photos of that aquarium, you can consult it and figure out, did something change that led me to have success previously that wasn't something like your chemical makeup or your feeding. So the other lovely thing that I love with biotopes specifically is you can change an aquarium over the seasons. So this was a tank set up by my friend Nick. It is a biotope of the streams that are in the DC area. And this is our kind of spring version of the tank. And then 6 months later, added a bunch of leaves, and now it is the fall in DC. So again, opportunities for change. So let's talk about how we actually capture photos. First, I'm going to go through the basics of my thought process when I'm capturing a photo for competition. And then we're going to actually go through and we're going to build a photo step by step so you can all see the process of how we photograph and how we light an aquarium. And hopefully that will be helpful for all of you, not just in photography, but in thinking about your aquariums.
A ago, you had 4 pictures.
Yeah.
Which one was the first and last one?
Yeah, that's a good question. So all of those were the tank within about the tank had been set up for about 8 months at that point. I think that they are in order of the oldest, then, and then the final photo. But basically, that was a pretty established tank that as I lost interest or gained interest, I trimmed it and reshaped the tank.
The final one was the lower right-hand one?
No, this is the final one. So ultimately, I decided that I wanted to have a carpet of Monte Carlo in the front, Marsilea hirsuta in the middle ground, and then the guapa grass in the background. But if you look at this tank, that is not how it always was. I was moving things around a fair amount. There's, hair grass right in here. I had a bunch of moss in it at one point, and I decided that was a mistake. So yeah, evolution. So, will I be allowed to move forward? That was not a reference to you, that was a reference to Keynote. So, this is a tank that was set up by Gazanfar. It was right around the corner from my favorite tank. And he wanted to enter this into, what did he want to enter it into? The ADA competition. That's IAPLC. Am I correct in that? Yeah. So we wanted to enter it into that contest. And to do that, he asked me to come over and photograph the aquarium. So the first thing we did is wait until nighttime. That's one of the biggest things that I can advocate for is photograph your tanks at night. The reason is that photographing a glass tank is really challenging. You get reflections everywhere. If you want to set yourself up for success, shoot at night and black out the tank. So that's what's happening here. If you see these black panels surrounding the tank, what I did was I went out and I bought some black cardboard from like a craft shop and built a frame around the tank. The reason I did that is it stops any of the light that's shining into the tank from bouncing off axis into my camera lens. If you struggle with things like lens flare or glare on the camera, the reason why that's happening is because you actually are pointing the camera directly at the light source. So adding that black frame cuts that out. When light enters a camera lens off axis, so not directly at you, but at an oblique angle, it will bounce around the lens, and sometimes that results in lens flare, which we all kind of know from movies where like you have dramatic light streaks. But it also can just generally desaturate the image. So what you'll end up with is you'll look at your photo and be like, this doesn't look quite as good. And perhaps the reason why is because the entire image is getting desaturated because of light leaking and bouncing around the camera. So, yeah, so I use mirrorless cameras. I think the result is the same for anything. So on my YouTube channel, I would say 90% of the videos I've shot have been using my Sony a7 III, which is a mirrorless camera. But about 10% I shot on my iPhone, and no one has ever made a comment that suggests that they noticed. So doesn't really matter what you shoot with. What matters is the principles behind it. And there are some cases to be made for why shooting on a cell phone is better, and I can talk about that a little bit later. So this was the first photo that I captured when we started the night. And it's a lovely tank, but this isn't a terribly pretty photo. And there are a couple of reasons why. One, the lighting on the actual plants and rocks isn't that strong. But more importantly, there's nothing to separate it from the background. So how we go about making the tank pop is we put a film on the back glass. You can do that with privacy film that you can get off Amazon or from Home Depot or Lowe's. And then we used a flash. So this is a strobe that is remotely triggered with my camera. That is one approach that you can use. I have also taken lights off of my other aquariums and just put it behind the aquarium that I'm trying to photograph. And if you put it down at the bottom and bounce the light at your privacy film, it'll diffuse it relatively well, and you can get a very similar effect. So I don't ever want this to feel like, oh, well, in order to take a nice photo, I've got to have a flash, because most of us have more than one aquarium, which means we have more than one light. So you can figure out a way to do this without that approach. But when you add a flash, you end up with a photo like this, which is a pretty dramatic difference. Now, the work that Gazanfar has put in is revealed. And when you do a side-by-side, I think that you can already tell there's a major difference in just adding that one flash. We didn't add any light above the aquarium. We only added the flash behind the aquarium. Yeah, it really changes the experience of the aquarium. So, the other really important thing as you go into the process of photographing your home aquarium is to think about how the photo that you see online is not the only photo that that person took. So over the course of the night, we took just over 3,000 photos of this aquarium. That's a photo every 2 seconds for about 3 hours, which might be rough for the fish, but because there's a flash going off every 3 seconds. But the result is that we're able to capture the fish in motion. And when you capture the fish in motion, each one of these photos reads very differently because the fish are in a different location. Expecting your fish to do exactly what you wanted them to do on the first photo is unrealistic. So whenever I decide to photograph an aquarium, I actually do say, I am going to show up at someone's house around 5 p.m. I will have all my lighting set up by 7, and then I will leave around midnight. And that's just the process. But the result is that we get a really good photo. So if we take a look at this photo, you can see the plants at the very top of the aquarium are reflected in the water. And that can be really nice, but many people find this to be relatively static. You basically have created a still life with some fish, but fundamentally it's a still life portrait. If you add ripples to the aquarium, suddenly it comes to life and there's a lot more movement. But if you looked at those photos, there was no filtration in the aquarium. So we had to add those ripples artificially. And that is why Gazanfar was behind that black panel earlier in this sequence, because he's standing here with a hairdryer. So this is my best suggestion or best tool for, sorry, I'm blocking everything. My best tool for photographing an aquarium is if you use a hairdryer, you can control exactly how and where the ripples form, which makes a big difference. If you're photographing a biotope where it's a fast-moving stream, you need those ripples to capture the essence of a stream. We also hold down the cool air setting on the hairdryer so that you're not blasting it with hot air. I've since brought a pole with me and just duct taped the hairdryer to the pole so that I didn't have to have someone stand there for like 3 hours. And that way I get exactly the angle that I want. So this was the final photo that we ended up going with. Yes?
A question from one of the people on YouTube.
Okay.
Is it okay to ask?
Sure.
Okay. So she said, how do you prevent background reflection, especially for videos, or I guess pictures too, like when you see your reflection on the background?
Yes, I will get to that in about 10 minutes, so don't move away from the live stream. So this was the final photo that we went with. We picked it because of the position of those fish. Now, they do kind of look photoshopped, because you can kind of like see some white there. They're not photoshopped. It's just that the flash behind the camera or behind that screen is backlighting them, so it's separating them from the background. But even though this is the photo that we went with, it's an imperfect photo. If we take a look at the close-up of the plants, you can see that all of these stems have started to close up. Picking a photo that you're really proud of is a series of compromises, and we felt that these plants, despite the fact that the stems are starting to close, was the best photo. When you compare it to what the plants looked like 3 hours earlier, you can see there's a big difference. So, still, we decided to go with this photograph. Now, if I were to do this again, photographing a stem-heavy tank, I would advise that the person who owns that tank shift their day-night cycle over the course of several weeks so that the tank is at full brightness in the middle of the night rather than in the middle of the day, because Plants don't know what time it is except by the light, so you can trick them. We didn't do that in this instance, but this is the photo we went with because of those fish. Now, unfortunately, they are fish, and this is not a photoshopped image, so there is one fish that kind of is ruining everything, but again, it's a series of compromises. So, now, let's talk about how we light an aquarium. So we've talked about photographing a really beautiful aquascape that's a really perfectly designed tank for photography. But if you start thinking about your home aquarium that you're really proud of, but that wasn't designed for a photo, how do we go about photographing it? And I decided to actually kind of do a demo. So this is a beautiful tank set up by Nick Kinzer, who has won the Biotope and Paludarium contest for AGA several times, all with photos that I took. So I'm going to take a tiny amount of credit. But he did, I would say, 98% of the work there. This is a tank that he has set up at the Glen Echo Park Aquarium. And I asked him to kind of let it go a little bit so that I could photograph it and show you guys the full process. So this is the tank when I first showed up. So this is going to answer the question from online of reflections. So you can see there are quite a few issues with this initial photo. First, the fish don't really separate from the background, which is a pretty common problem if you're talking about a biotope where the fish aren't the showiest. There are lots of Cares fish here that would probably be in a similar state where they're kind of a grayish silver fish and they don't pop from the background. In addition, this tank has all of its filtration built in. It's plumbed in a way that we could not remove any of the filtration. So I needed to figure out a way to photograph it while leaving the filtration in place. In addition, there's a bunch of algae, which is common in a home aquarium. It's less common in the aquarium that Nick runs at the Glen Echo Park Aquarium, but it can still show up. Lots of stuff on the back glass. We'll also see that this back glass is painted with black paint on the outside, so I can't backlight this aquarium. So we've got to come up with another solution. In addition, you can see the reflection of a window in the background. Even though this was photographed at night, there's still light in the room, and it's still bouncing all around. And then there's all of the filtration on the other side of the tank, as well as the CO2 lines. So lots of issues. So how do we go about solving these? We're going to go step by step. The first, which addresses the question of how do you get rid of your reflection, is you turn off every single light in the room but the ones on the aquarium. It's really the main thing. When I did that, you can see what happens. Very quickly, everything that was reflected disappears. It's really cool. The next thing that you want to go about doing is setting your color balance. So I don't want to get super technical, but all light has a color temperature. And if you want an accurate rendering of the aquarium, you need to mimic the color temperature of the light that's entering the aquarium. There are a lot of ways to do this. Your camera phones do a pretty good job of doing it automatically, but if you have a DSLR or mirrorless camera, you can set the color balance to be accurate. The way that I would do that is you can put a piece of white plastic in the aquarium and then color balance off of that. If people have specific questions about how to color balance, talk with me after. I'm happy to get into it. I don't want to get too in the weeds. But color balance alone, or color correction alone, gets you to a photo like this, which we're starting to make some progress. We still have the problem of it's clearly an aquarium, and there's clearly algae on the back. So how do we go about solving that? The answer is really, really, really simple. And this is the coolest trick that you all can do, not just for photographs, but for your general aquarium to look better. And that's moving the lights to the front of the tank. Just that means that the back of the tank disappears, and the thing that you care about is properly lit. So I also wanted to play with light in this because ultimately it's a bunch of rocks. So how can we make it more interesting? So I used in my little bag of tricks, I used some colored LEDs. I shoot a bunch of interviews, and that means I have light panels that have RGB LEDs in them, which you may not have. We can talk about how you can solve this. So I turned off the main lights and then turned on the LEDs. I wanted to have some color on one side and different color on the other side and add something a little bit more dynamic. You can do the same thing by going to a craft store and getting cellophane, colored cellophane, and wrapping it around your light bar. Pretty easy, it works really well. When you add the main lights back in, the effect is pretty subtle. There's a little bit of color difference between the two rocks. I'll show you what it looked like without, and then what it looks like with. It's really, really subtle. You can see it a little bit closer if you zoom in. You can see how this rock has a little bit of a warmish hue. Now, ultimately, I was experimenting with this, and I didn't think that it was doing a whole lot. And the reason why it wasn't doing a whole lot is because I wasn't embracing what this aquascape was, or what this biotope was. This is a shallow stream in Northern Virginia, and streams, especially slower moving streams, tend to have algae on the rocks. And I wasn't embracing that. There's algae on the rocks, but I was kind of covering it up with some reddish light and all this kind of thing. So I switched the RGB lights to be green, and I highlighted the algae. And the result is that the very tip of that rock feels green, as if there's algae and sunlight hitting it. You can see this is what the top of the tank looks like. So I've got my light panel shining down on the rock. We've got the light strips that were previously lighting the whole tank, pushed as far forward as possible. And that's about it. Now, this is starting to look much better, but there's still some issues. One of the main ones is that the fish are still blending in. I really wanted these fish to pop because this is a tank about the fish. It's not about the aquascape behind the fish. And they were disappearing. So the first thing I tried doing was adding some light. Now, there's already a bunch of light at the front of the tank, so how do I add more light on the fish specifically? The answer is not to light from above, but to light from below or from the front. So these fish are reflective. They have, a nice glimmer to them. So if you point a light from the front, you can catch the light on their scales, and suddenly they separate from the tank. Now, I initially used white light, and I thought it did an okay job. Then I added blue light, and the reason I added blue light, I wanted to try this out. I wanted to see, well, we typically think of cool water as being blue and cold, so maybe if I added some blue to it, it would make this tank feel a little bit cooler. And it does to some degree. It definitely makes the fish stand out from the background, but it doesn't feel natural. So ultimately, I added some amber light to the aquarium. I'll show you a photo where this lighting was coming from in a moment, but basically, I'm just shining a little bit of amber light on the fish, and the result is that they really stand out from the background. There's just a little bit of color added to them, and even when you look at rocks, the fish are standing out against the background. So when I zoom out, you can kind of see how this was done. You can see the amber light coming from below and hitting the bottom of the tank, and thus reflecting on all of their fins. If I show you the wide shot of what this looks like, you can see I have a little amber light strip pointed up from directly below the camera. I couldn't bring it much higher than that, or the light would reflect in the glass of the tank, and it would ruin the illusion. But it's just enough. Now, this photo, I want to highlight another important thing. I don't necessarily recommend going out and buying a bunch of equipment. One thing that I would recommend doing is buying a cheap tripod. When you're talking about photography, it's really valuable to actually have a tripod. Both because that allows you to take longer exposures if there's not enough light in an aquarium, because while we think of aquariums as being well lit, they're actually really, really dark. So you may need to have a longer exposure time to get proper exposure. But also, it's really hard to be consistent in your placement. What I've found is that I think I'm centered on an aquarium. I'm taking a picture, and then when I look back at the photos, they're wildly off-center, and one side of the tank is bigger than the other side of the tank because I'm like a few inches off to the side. If you can solve that one time and just have the tripod, all of your photos will look better. And if you follow my advice and commit to spending an evening photographing a tank, you probably don't want to hold that camera or phone anyway. A tripod like this one that's filming me right now is a pretty good example of you can get a camera mount or a tripod mount for your cell phone that works great. So this is the work in progress, and you can see that we're not tapping. You can see a hand there that's on the glass. We're not tapping the glass. We're not trying to scare the fish, but the fish are trained to come to someone accidentally because they want food. So all Nick needed to do was kind of dangle his hand near the side of the tank, and the fish would all run in one direction, and then we could dangle our hand on the other side, and the fish would run in the opposite direction. And the result is that you would get something that felt a little bit more authentic to nature, because in a stream, most fish are swimming against the current. So you want most of your fish to swim against the current. And this was ultimately the photo that we ended up with. So this is the unprocessed photo that we did nothing to. And this is where we started about an hour and a half earlier. It's a pretty big difference. We didn't clean the tank. We didn't do anything to the tank other than change the lighting. Yeah, so if we zoom in, you can see most of the fish are going in the right direction. Some of them are not. That's frustrating to me. But this tank is not for photo competition, so I'm okay with manipulating it. Because overall, most of these fish are doing a really beautiful job of emulating a stream. So now I'm going to take us one step further into the photo manipulation portion of this. Again, yes?
Did you box that tank out ever?
No.
So you didn't, okay.
No. The reason why I didn't is because the camera was low enough that the lights were so low to the tank that I didn't have any light leak. But if you have elevated lights or lights that are even like 3 inches above the tank, you're gonna have that issue. But no, I didn't have to in this one. Thank you for asking that. So I wanted to get rid of all the distractions here. This is stuff that's very simple to do if you have any familiarity with photo editing software. So I will talk you through this. The first thing that I did, let's see, what did I do? Yes, the first thing I did was I just darkened all of the silicone and edges. And then I went through and I removed all the fish that were going the wrong direction. I was able to do that because I had like 3,000 photos. So I could pick a photo that was the exact same photo, but there wasn't a fish there, and I would just take that bit of rock and put it over the fish, and ta-da, there's no fish. Didn't add any fish, just removed pesky fish. Yes?
The tripod, nothing moved, and your framing didn't move, right?
Yes.
You could just go straight over.
Exactly, yeah. It was like super, super simple, no issues at all. So the next thing I did was I cropped the photo so that I got rid of all of that distracting surface area, because I didn't use a hairdryer on it. I just didn't bring it with me, and I kind of was imagining cropping it from the very beginning, and I wasn't going to lower the tank water down to make that happen. So we just removed all of the distractions, and now you're left with I'm so sorry, guys. What you're left with is what I think is a pretty beautiful demonstration of Nick's work. And that's important because this tank has been set up for like 2 or 3 years now and is probably going to go away. And now Nick has this in his portfolio as an aquarist. He can go and convince some major aquarium to hire him. If you're a major aquarium, you should hire Nick Kinzer because he's great. Case in point, this is also Nick's work. This was the first place paludarium for AGA a couple of years ago. This was a particularly challenging setup because light is a huge amount of water. And this needed to be exposed the same as the terrestrial area. So the first thing that we did was move the lights around so that they weren't hitting the back area too much and overexposing it. But the other thing that I did was I added some lights on the side. So I used, I think it was basically like a shop light, pointed it at the side. You can see that this gravel is a little bit lit up relative to that side, but I really needed to get some light in there. So you don't always need to light from above. You can light from the side and really fill in shadows. And then we used another technique, which is called flagging in photography. Flagging is where you block light. So you don't always want maximum light. In fact, oftentimes you don't want that much light. In this instance, the bars were providing all of the light for the aquarium, but they were really, really overexposing the image on the philodendron. Is that what that is? Anyone know what the red plant is? Not that? I don't know. I don't know terrestrial plants at all. So what we did was we wrapped some towel around the bar up there, and that allowed us to keep that plant properly exposed. So next thing I want to talk with you guys about is getting up close. You know, how do we explore an aquarium or explore the fish in a way that actually celebrates the fish? So this is not a thing that I do very frequently, but this was a tank that I filmed up with Ricky Chawla. Ricky, he's the one that did the orb earlier that you saw. And this is a decade-old tank. It's got some pretty rough algae issues in the bucephalant, or in the bulbitis, but the fish that are in this tank are incredible. It's a bunch of hill stream fish. So we needed to go about the process of how to actually film these. And for something like this, you had to think about fish in the same way that you talk about natural history. So in natural history filmmaking, when you're trying to film an animal, you think about the animal's behavior when you're filming. And the reason why you do that is because you can't set up a camera on where the animal is right now. You need to set up a camera for where the animal will be. So if you understand your fish's behavior, you understand what type of part of the tank that fish lives in, you can set up your tank or your camera and photograph the fish in action or video the fish in action rather than chasing the fish around. Again, this is something that while I'm shooting video here, the ratio is still very similar to when I shot 3,000 photos for one photo. Oftentimes I'm setting up the camera and I am just hanging out by that rock for like 10 minutes because I know that fish go there and I'm just waiting for them to actually show up. Now, when you talk about fish like these native fish, they're not as exciting as some of the fish that we keep in the home aquarium, at least not visually as exciting. So it's a little bit more challenging to photograph them. I took some photos of them up close. They look okay. Again, same premise where what I did was I locked down the camera and just took a bunch of photos, and when a fish swam through my shot, I had the photo. I didn't try to chase the fish around because there lies madness. It's impossible. Yes?
Are you using a macro lens or a zoom lens?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I am not using a macro lens here. I probably should be using a macro lens, but at the time I didn't actually own one because lenses are expensive. So what I used here are what are called extension tubes. So if you have a camera that has multiple lenses, you can take the camera or the lens off the camera, and then you can get basically just a piece of aluminum. They sell these. You don't have to design this yourself. That's called an extension tube. And what it does is it shifts the focal plane of the lens, and it can convert a normal lens into a macro lens. Now, there are a lot of compromises that are made when that happens, but if you're trying to take photographs of your fish and you don't want to spend an extra $1,000 on a lens that you won't use for anything else, you can buy a $30 extension tube and solve that problem pretty well. So, I took pictures of them schooling. I took pictures of them, you know, as lined up to the camera as possible. And then I also took some photos of the more benthic animals. Now, with benthic species, you can do something really cool, which is called image stacking. And you can do this with plants as well if you need to photograph plants. Image stacking is again, relatively simple technique that you can use in Photoshop, where you take a photo of a macro object, and then you shift the focal plane slightly down the fish. You take another photo, slightly down the fish, take a photo. Now the fish has to hold still, and you can't tell it to hold still, so you just kind of have to work with a fish that is willing to hang out. But when you stack them all together, you can suddenly get a fish that's fully in focus, which is really cool. Now, earlier I experimented with shining light up at the fish in Nick's aquarium to kind of capture something special. I tried this again to kind of focus on the biology of the fish rather than the color pattern, but the actual structure of the fish. And in doing that, I photographed the fish using a blue light from above. That's basically just the moonlight on the fish, and then an orange light from below. And in the process, you kind of reveal the topography of the fish, and in proper lighting, you can also reveal the structure of each of the individual scales. And you can get a different perspective on that fish, which I think can be valuable if you're photographing basically a silverfish that's not that exciting. So now I want to kind of take a little bit of a pivot and go out into the wild for just a moment. So these next series of photos are photos that I took in Brazil about 3 weeks ago. This is Piabeta, a fisher person on the Rio Negro, catching cardinal tetras in the wild. So she uses this big net, she scoops up the fish. The reason why I'm showing you this is I want to provide a little bit of context because I really wanted to capture photos of cardinal tetras. So they would catch these fish, this big buckets. You'd have 1,000, maybe 2,000 fish in one of these tubs, and those tubs go all the way downstream to Manaus, and then are shipped to Sao Paulo, and then shipped to other parts of the world. It's a really arduous process. But while down there, I also got to stick my head in the water and look at some fish. Captured some fish of, this is a peacock bass, this is a breeding pair of peacock bass. The fry are behind this tree. They were very protective of it. It's relatively easy to photograph large fish. It's more challenging to photograph small fish in the wild. This is an undescribed species of tetra. You can actually see, this is a flooded forest. You can kind of see the forest up above the water line. But I really struggled to capture cardinal tetras, which is what I really wanted to photograph, which is why I set up a tank about them, and that's where we're headed. But I was able to capture some photographs of the cardinal tetras in holding pens where they were being brought for sale. And they're really, really beautiful fish. And I really wanted to capture a photograph of them in the wild, but I was never really able to. This is about the closest that I could get, and these aren't cardinal tetras. These are some other type of tetra. But you can see the habitat that's there. And you can also see how much malm there is on everything, which the tank that I'm about to show you doesn't have. But that's okay. It's still won first place, so I'll take it. So this is why I set up this tank. It was because I really wanted to capture the spirit of the cardinal tetras in the wild where I saw them. To do that, I again used the same kind of lighting approach that I used for the other tanks. But because this was in my living room, I could spend 12 hours staring at them and filming them, rather than kind of jumping in the water, filming for 20 minutes, and then getting out. And the result is that these fish kind of look wild, kind of. If I told you this was wild, maybe you'd believe me. But I also wanted to photograph the fish and actually celebrate the individual fish, which brought me to building a setup to photograph individual fish. So this is my solution for that. That was the tank that had the cardinal tetra set up in it. This is my living room filled with stuff. And this is the camera that I used. It's mounted very professionally on top of a bonsai pot. And that is the tank that I used to photograph fish. This is a tank that I built myself. It's 1.5 inches deep, front to back, and it's about 18 inches from side to side, about 12 inches tall. I probably could have built something smaller, but I really wanted to try to capture kind of a school of fish rather than an individual fish. The reason why I built such a narrow tank is because I didn't want the fish to go off axis. I wanted them to always be pointed directly parallel to the camera, because when you're photographing a really small thing, as I'm sure you all know, depth of field becomes a real problem. So by doing something like this, don't give the fish a lot of places to go. You can kind of see them all oriented sideways. Now they can turn around. I wanted to make it large enough that they could actually turn around, but it's not a comfortable position for them. And the result is that they stay pretty much consistently in this orientation. You'll also see that in this setup, I have a heater for this tiny tank. And the reason I have a heater is because water, when freshly added to an aquarium, gases off and you get lots of bubbles on the glass. So the solution to that, if anyone has a better solution, please tell me. The solution that I came up with was just having the water in the tank for like 12 hours so that it could gas off on its own, because I couldn't get my hand in there to actually get the bubbles off. So I just had the water in there, and then I added the fish, and then I couldn't catch the fish afterwards because it's 1.5 inches thick, so I had to dump the whole thing out and then start again the next day with a new system. This was my dining room table, so I didn't have any place to eat for like 3 weeks. It was great. But the result is that I got really close-up photos of cardinal tetras. Now, these photos were taken with film lights. So those are lower light output lights than a flash photo. I've used film lights for everything here rather than photo lights, and that's because that's what I have access to. But if you were to use photo lights, you can get even more depth of field. But after taking photos with the white background, I wanted to play around. Again, I think it's all about celebrating what you're working with. I added an orange background behind the aquarium, and what that kind of did was it highlighted the beautiful orange of the eye of the cardinal tetra, which is a thing that you probably don't notice on a regular basis because we're all focused on the red and the blue. But if you add different colors, you see how the fish changes. Then I added red to see what that would do. Highlighted the blue for sure, kind of robs the fish of a lot of its majesty. And then ultimately, I took this photo of the 3 cardinals in front of a green background. And I think that works really well. So all of these were taken with not professional cameras, but nice-ish cameras. I also want to talk with you guys really briefly about how you can take macro photographs with your phone, relatively inexpensively. So just a lens like this does a really great job of making your camera phone into a macro camera. This is an attachment that just clips onto your phone. You can buy them on Amazon for around $50. And the result is that you can actually take macro photos with them. So if you're hoping to take pictures of your killifish or any small fish that you really want to celebrate, getting something like this will go a long way. Now, with a camera phone like this, or really any setup, you want to add as much light to the tank as possible so that you can really capture the animal, because light gets really quickly absorbed by water. So you can use any lighting that you have around your house. For me, that's camera gear. For all of you, that might be using as many of the lights off of your other aquariums as possible to really blast that aquarium. The more light that you get in, the better off you'll be. But you can get pretty good results with a camera phone like this. So I just photographed a couple of aquatic plants. This was, I photographed the day of my talk at AGA. So I photographed all these in my hotel room. And you can see some really interesting things. You can start to see the actual structure of the leaves. You can see all the veins of the leaf, and you can see beautiful color. And it's something that's only possible with that little macro lens. Now, I photographed these in my hotel room, and I think they look pretty decent for what they are. But there was a trick here, and the trick is that I didn't have all these colored backgrounds, at least not for this. My home had colored backgrounds, but here, I just used this laptop. And I went into Photoshop, I created a color palette that I liked, and then I just photographed the plant in front of the screen of my laptop. And the result is that you have a glowing background that fills the tank, and you can really take a beautiful photo. Now, this tank, if you don't want to build your own tank for photographing things, you can get these on Amazon, again, for $30, $40. They are sold as betta tanks, and you absolutely shouldn't put a betta in them, but you can put a fish in it for like 20 minutes and take some beautiful photos of it, or some plants. So, with that, I want to wrap up, and I hope that the result of spending this time with me is that you have a different appreciation for how light and materials can change how your aquarium looks, and that it doesn't seem quite so intimidating to take photos of them.
Does it matter if the tank's acrylic, glass, or plastic?
In terms of photographing, or that's a good question. To be totally transparent, I rarely photograph with acrylic. I think acrylic has a bigger problem with off-axis viewing. So again, it would be very important to be head-on, but it shouldn't make a huge difference. Acrylic tends to scratch more, which could be an issue, but you know whether or not you have scratches in your tank. Yes?
This was a fantastic talk, by the way.
Thank you.
But my question is, as you know, I do mostly all looking at grow blackwater things. The concept is the same for trying to capture
Yes.
the beauty or essence of the blackwater?
Yes, so with Blackwater, and I really love Blackwater tanks because they give you more permission to actually experiment and play around, whereas a traditional aquascape, you're kind of just getting even lighting. With a Blackwater tank, how I think about lighting those tanks is think about where the light would come from in the natural environment. So for instance, I photographed another one of Nick's tanks that had some sunfish in it. These beautiful sunfish. They were all around this root mass. And there was no life in the top water because all these sunfish are relatively benthic animals. So the question that I had was, how do you go about photographing something that is not going to really fill the frame properly, but is kind of a Blackwater setup? So what I did was I thought about where would these fish be. These fish are in a habitat where they're often right by the shoreline, and there's plants, trees growing above, so the light is really mottled, and there's sunbeams pouring through. So I wanted to build sunbeams, and how I did that was I used spotlights shining through the water to create the sunbeams. Then I used aluminum foil to break up those spotlights so that they became individual little beams. And then to make the spotlights pop, I added silt to the aquarium, just for the photographs. So basically, rather than try to clean out the sand, we all know that if you don't wash sand, you get a really muddy mess. I made that little muddy mess, put it in a turkey baster, and then squirted a bunch of that muddy mess into the aquarium. And the result is that the sunbeams were caught by all the silt in the water column, and suddenly you had really, really incredible depth. Yeah, that was his competition tank. He got third place this past year with that tank. Yeah, so that's how I think about Blackwater tanks and biotope tanks, is think about where the light would actually be and then try to emulate it. Don't try to light everything evenly. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they think about lighting, is you just put as much light in there as possible. But Lighting changes the mood of an aquarium. And if you light something properly, you can take an aquarium that's not that exciting and make it really magical feeling. Or you could take a tank that's really good and make it incredible. But if you light everything evenly, you're not making a huge difference. And I think that's one of the things that people really run into. Any other questions, specifics? Yes?
When using an SLR, are there certain settings you stick to?
Yeah, so fish are fast, but they're not crazy fast. So if you know anything about cameras, there are 3 settings that you have to consider. There's ISO, which is how sensitive the sensor is. There is aperture, which is how wide or closed the lens is. A really wide aperture has a really shallow depth of field. Lets a lot of light in, but it's really, really shallow depth of field. A really closed aperture lets almost no light in, but it has really deep depth of field. And then the last thing is shutter speed. So in an aquarium, you can only add so much light. I would love to add natural daylight, but it's really challenging. So you often are ending up shooting in a really low light situation. So what I would do with your camera is boost the ISO up to the point that you're comfortable with. So that's your first step, is say, all right, if I go to an ISO of 2000, and I'm sorry if this is too technical, but if I go to an ISO of 2000, I'm starting to get some noise, and it's noise that I'm comfortable with, but if I go any higher, not comfortable with that. So you set your ISO, because that's the thing that you really can't control after that. Then shutter speed is also the next most important thing, because fish move quickly, but not that quickly. And I find that a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second is doable, but the fish are going to be a little bit blurred. A shutter speed of like 150 is pretty close to what you actually want, but that may not be possible with the lighting that you have. And then it's all about opening up the aperture as much as you can, or closing the aperture as much as you can while still being exposed. So ideally, you want as much depth as possible in your camera, which means that you want as closed an iris as you can, but you might have to open it up. So that's what I would do. ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Anyone else? Yes?
So earlier in your talk, you were talking about, when you were talking about reflection, that there's on the camera, like a black.
Yeah.
So for like, if you have a phone to take a picture with,
Yeah.
you like makeshift a little black something to put around your camera? Would that help, or?
So yeah, there's the easier thing to probably do is to block the light source from hitting the camera, rather than adding a lens hood to the camera. You could do that, but the easier thing, that less finicky, is just to put something in between the camera. It is almost always a good idea to do that when you're photographing with your phone, because the phone tends to have a really wide aperture, or excuse me, it's a wide angle lens. It's wider than most lenses. So you're going to be closer to the tank, and as a result, things are going to reflect more. That's something I didn't talk about, which is if you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera that you have multiple lenses for, generally I try to photograph things at around 50 millimeter. The reason why I do that is it allows me to step quite far away from the tank, which means that less light is hitting me as I'm photographing. 50, 35 is probably about as close as I would get. The other thing that does is and this is a personal preference, it all comes down to your aesthetics. The farther away that you get from the tank, the less reflective the side panels are, the less you're seeing reflected in the side panels of the tank. So you get more focus of the tank. Some people like having that massive expanse, and they like having like extra views in the side panels. I personally don't. So it all comes down to preference. But the farther you get away from the tank, the less reflection there's going to be, and the less likely that you're going to see your little silhouette in the tank. All right. Well, if anyone has any specific questions, please feel free to talk to me after this. Thank you so much for having me. I turned this off.